This afternoon, we have the pleasure to interview Mrs. Jean Wisniak, Walnut Street Apartments, Salem, Indiana, regarding her father, William Edward Glass, and his date of birth is August the 26th, 1898. My name is Pat McClain, and I'm on the staff of United States Senator Richard Lugar. With me is Gertrude Stevenson, the Washington County Coordinator for the Veterans History Project, along with Kathy Williams, who is the granddaughter of Mr. Glass. Okay, if you would please tell us what it was like having your father in the military and what it was like for you going through World War I and World War II, or World War II, I suppose, not World War I. Excuse me.
Well, I titled this, Dear Daddy, His Story. The day after World War I was declared, William Edward Glass and his father, James L. Glass, went down to the recruiting office to enlist. James L. Glass was refused because he was an engineer on the L&N Railroad, and that was considered to be an occupation necessary to the war effort. My father, William Edward Glass, was inducted into the Army that day, and henceforth Private William Edward Glass. He vividly remembered his first 3 days of training. The soldiers were issued a blanket and a bed sack, which they quickly filled with straw from a nearby field. Then, after 3 days of eating salmon, apples, and baked eggs, believe me, he never wanted any of those again. My mother tried any number of ways of fixing salmon, and he could smell it as soon as he hit the door and said, I'm leaving, I'm going out and have lunch. During this time, he was one of the thousands who contracted influenza that killed so many World War I soldiers. The story he told was he was at Camp Taylor just out of Louisville, Kentucky. He had been in the service just long enough to get his marksmanship badge and a commendation for officers' training school. He wasn't feeling well and requested a leave of absence to visit his parents in Louisville. The request was granted for a 3-day pass. When he arrived at his home, his mother realized he was really sick and sent for the family doctor, Dr. Gosnell. He gave her medicine, and with good home care, he survived, unlike so many other soldiers who perished from this outbreak. On the 4th day of his leave, the MPs came with an ambulance from Camp Taylor. He was considered absence without leave as well as being ill. He was admitted to a ward, and he told me he watched the men on each side up and down the ward die, be covered up, and carried out. If it hadn't been for him being at home and receiving immediate care from his mother, he would have been one of those being carried out. As only 3 men left that ward alive, and Daddy was one of them. Shortly after that, he was sent to officers' training school again at Camp Taylor. He joined the reserves in August of 1921 and served actively until 1940. He served in the Kentucky National Guard from 1921 till 1923 as first lieutenant in the field artillery. And at that time, that meant the cavalry, and you can see there's the picture of him on the horse. Then he was transferred to the Infantry Reserve in 1926. He was promoted to captain in the reserves in 1930 and promoted to grade of major in August of 1943. After his discharge, he was upgraded to lieutenant colonel's rank, which he held at the time of his death in 1987. He was 89 years old. Louisville hosted the American Legion Convention in 1929. At that time, Lieutenant Glass was part of the Horse Patrol for General George C. Pershing. I can remember him coming in the front door dressed in jodhpurs, sand-bound belt, full jacket, hat, sword, and boots. He was so excited as he unbuckled his sword and belt. General Pershing had shook hands with all the patrol members, and when speaking to Daddy, he said, "If it had not been for all you boys at home who backed us up, we couldn't have won the war." World War I in a parentheses. This has been stated many times by people in recent years, but maybe this was the first. I was so proud of him that day. He was in a uniform I'd never seen before, and was so thrilled to have spoken with the general who had won the war. My father was always regretful that he had not gone overseas during either war. He came close, being on the list several times, but something always prevented him from leaving. Of course, we, as his family, were always very thankful. In 1931, another daughter was born, Margie. Now we were a family of 4. In civilian life, he was actively connected with the Courier-Journal and Louisville Times from 1920 to 1934 as automotive advertising manager. During that time, he also graduated from the University of Louisville Law School and was in private practice when he met and married Frances Miller in 1925. I was born in 1926 and always associated my father with both the Army and the newspaper. He left the newspaper in 1934 to join Chevrolet Motor Company as a district manager. His background as automotive editor made him well known to the dealers in the territory of Indiana, Kentucky, and Tennessee. We moved first to Lexington, Kentucky, and later to Nashville, Tennessee. In 1938, he entered the automobile business for himself as a Chevrolet dealer in Salem, Indiana. He was in business for 5 years before being recalled to active duty in 1942. It wasn't as if we were unprepared for a recall, but he had retired from the reserves when he bought the business. But still, it was a shock to see his face when he received orders to report for a physical. Several months followed before he received the results. It was marked overweight, turnover. There in bold print was stamped, overweight, weighed by order of the adjutant general. He looked at all 3 of us and said, "Good gosh, I'm in the Army and don't know it." He immediately set about trying to get his things in order. He turned the business over to his employees to operate on a profit-sharing basis for the duration. Our family continued to reside in Salem until war shortages made it so that we had to close the house and make other plans. At this time, I was starting my junior year in high school. Margie was still in grade school. It was only sensible to try and stay where we were. We had made many friends and knew that help would come when needed. Our mother was a tower of strength, as most women were at that time in history. Daddy had just been named post commander of Cecil Grimes' post number 41, American Legion. Although he offered his resignation because he'd been recalled to service in the Army Air Force, the members voted not to accept his resignation and proceeded to install he and the other officers. Captain Glass was to remain in this office and absentee him until he returned from service in 1944. Captain Glass was commanding officer of Section N, one of the organizations that cares for the technical students of this post of Army Air Force Training Command. He served as an adjutant in this sector before becoming its commander, March 1st, 1943. Chanute Field, you see, was a training camp for men to work on heavy planes, B-17s, B-24s, and lastly, B-29s. At times, there were over 5,000 to 6,000 men under his command. In the spring of 1943, the furnace in the house at Salem broke down. No parts were available at the time, so nothing to do but stick it out with kerosene heaters until the end of school. Yes, I singed my eyebrows lighting the heaters. I was 16 years old. I was a very proud senior Girl Scout. I was the first one in the state of Indiana. Mother needed all the help Margie and I could provide, and I didn't know any better. We sat by the light of the radio each night to hear the news. I learned to knit in the dark, and we all did our best for the war effort. Came May, school let out. Mother and Daddy decided, since he seemed to be permanently settled stateside, we should move to Champaign, Illinois, and Daddy would move from the officers' quarters into town. We spent a wonderful summer in Champaign. This city was so much larger than Salem, yet not as large as Louisville or Nashville. There was bus transportation, and we girls were accepted at the YMCA. The YMCA and YWCA were combined in the city. We got to use a much larger library than we were used to. What was really a thrill for 2 young girls, and mothers too, I'm sure, was pulling up at the gate, being saluted and waved on. It was a thrill to go to the Officers' Club to eat dinner, to listen to swing music, and watch the dancing as long as it wasn't too late. Gene Krupa was in Daddy's squadron, and we heard him play many times. As well as 2 young men who were the lifeguards at the Officers' Club pool. They took us under their wing, as I'm sure Daddy had asked them to do. But our swimming improved immensely that summer. But trouble was on the horizon. In July, Daddy's name was posted for overseas duty. Of course, he also received his majority. Mother got to pin on the oak leaves, and we had decisions to make once again. When the grandparents were told what was going on, there was no alternative except to return to Louisville and stay with Mother's parents until the war was over. Daddy's parents were near but didn't have room for 3 more people in their house. However, we saw them often and were always welcome. Then came the important decision, where to go to school. Louisville, being much larger than either of us were used to, presented a problem. If we were enrolled in public school at that time, one of us would take the bus in one direction, the other in another direction. But if my parents could compromise and send us both to a parochial school on the same bus line, we could start out together and many times be on the same bus coming home. Remember, this was a city bus, and we had to walk 2 blocks to the house. Also, Louisville was still in the days of boys in one high school and girls in another. Thus, we ended up going to Presentation Academy. I was scared, and I knew my sister was scared too, so we banded together and started school for the rest of the war. As it turned out, the war changed. Daddy was never sent overseas. And when this was evident, he requested voluntary retirement from active duty with the Army Air Forces. As follows, Brigadier General R.E. O'Neill, Commanding General of Chanute Field, announced the following. Major Glass returned to the service where an acute need for experienced officers existed. His services were of an excellent nature, and it is only through a reduction in Army Air Force training program requirements that the release of Major Glass from active duty is possible. Daddy walked through the front door around 4 p.m., June 9, 1944. I graduated from high school June 9, 8 p.m., 1944. I will always remember how wonderful I thought that it was that his accrued leave came at just the right time for my graduation. But if you think about it, I bet the adults planned it that way. We all returned to Salem, Indiana to resume life in a normal way. Only it was time for college and another big challenge. My father was always one of those millions of men who stayed in the background, giving the others training and skills to go to the front. He was a lawyer, newspaperman, and businessman in his own right, and so he was well prepared for the above role when called back to active duty in 1942. Both Margie and I loved and respected him and all he tried to do in his lifetime. There will never be another time like theirs. Mother and Daddy, we salute you.
Oh, that's very nice. Really.
That all right?
Oh, it's beautiful, yes.
Transported me right with you.
Yeah.
You done good.
Okay. I was supposed to fill that out. I would like for you to send, okay.
When Mr. Glass had gone into the service. I'm Ginger Morris, and I'm reporting something that my husband John Morris told me that he had heard at Lions Club, because Ed used to tell this story at Lions Club. It was about getting his first uniform, and he was an officer, of course, and he had gotten his uniform. He was so proud of it. It was really looking good, and I guess he had been in the Army perhaps for a little while. Anyway, he said he had lost his stomach, and he was looking really sharp, really, really good. And he was very proud of the way he looked in the uniform, so he decided to have a haircut, and he decided that he would not get an Army haircut. He would get a civilian haircut because he thought they did a much better job. So he went to the barber shop, and he got a haircut, and everybody had commented on how nice he looked in his uniform, and, you know, he was talking about how proud he was of it and everything like that. And he got up from the barber chair, walked out the door, and a bird pooped mulberry on him, flew over, all down the front of his uniform.
Oh.
And he was distressed, to say the least. And what's more, the stain stayed in. It never did come completely out. There was always this faint shadow of mulberry stain.
Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. Ooh.
Now, there we go.
Now, this is Jeannie Wozniak again. Colonel Glass's daughter. He was home on leave from Chanute Field. This must have been during the summertime, or else maybe it was over a Thanksgiving holiday. Anyhow, we had a big family dinner, and iced tea was served, and he spilt the iced tea all down his newly pressed uniform. He was dressed and ready to drive home to Chanute Field, drive back to Chanute Field, and of course, in those days, the roads were not good. It must have been a Thanksgiving dinner, because I think that's when he said he drove through so much snow on the way in. But Mother had to wash and iron that uniform and get it back to spick and span before he could get started, and it took, I have no idea how many hours it took at that time to drive from Louisville, Kentucky to Chanute Field.